Long before Kamakura became the center of Japan's first enduring warrior government, political life revolved around another city more than 300 miles to the west. Kyoto had served as the imperial capital since the late 8th century. Its avenues, palaces, temples, aristocratic residences, and surrounding estates formed the center of the world inhabited by Japan's court nobility. The emperor remained the sacred sovereign at the heart of this order, while powerful aristocratic families competed for access to the throne and the offices that surrounded it. For much of the Heian period, the most successful of these families had been the Fujiwara, whose influence rested less upon military conquest than upon marriage, court rank, and their ability to place themselves beside successive emperors. This was the political world that later generations of samurai would inherit. But it should not be imagined as a simple centralized state waiting to be overthrown. By the 11th and 12th centuries, authority in Japan was already divided among overlapping institutions. Emperors reigned alongside retired emperors who could continue exercising considerable influence after formally leaving the throne. Great aristocratic houses possessed their own networks of clients and estates. Powerful Buddhist temples and monasteries controlled substantial lands and could become political forces in their own right. Far from Kyoto, provincial officials, estate managers, local landholders, and armed families dealt with problems that the court could rarely supervise directly. Political power was becoming dispersed even while Kyoto remained its recognized center. Much of the wealth supporting this society came from the countryside. Across Japan, complexes of privately controlled estates known as shogun existed alongside lands remaining under provincial administration. Their ownership could be complicated. A piece of farmland cultivated by villagers might have claims attached to it by local managers, provincial figures, religious institutions, aristocratic patrons, and others whose rights overlapped rather than fitting neatly beneath a single owner. Connections with powerful temples or aristocratic families could protect an estate from interference, while disputes over boundaries, taxes, appointments, and access to resources were common enough that influence in Kyoto mattered even to the people who rarely saw the capital. Yet, a document issued in Kyoto could only accomplish so much in a distant province. Land had to be guarded. Taxes had to be collected. Disputes sometimes needed more than a written judgment. Roads could be dangerous. Rebellious officials had to be confronted, and rival claimants occasionally settled matters with weapons before anyone at court could intervene. Out of these practical needs grew families whose value rested partly on their ability to use organized force. The warriors who emerged from this environment were not originally a separate ruling caste standing outside the old system. They developed within it. Earlier Japanese governments had used conscript armies and official military forces, but during the Heian period, professional fighting men became increasingly important. Contemporary terminology varied, although bushi would eventually become one of the common words for these martial retainers. Many were mounted fighters skilled with the bow, operating through family and personal relationships that connected lesser warriors to more influential military leaders. Their interests often remained firmly rooted in land, inheritance, office, and local status. Warfare was a profession, but it was also one's means of protecting a household's place within provincial society. Some warrior lineages possessed especially distinguished ancestry, Among the most important were branches of the Taira and Minamoto, both of which trace descent from the imperial family. Over generations, members of these families spread into the provinces, acquired local connections, served officials and aristocrats, and accumulated military reputations of their own. The eastern provinces became particularly important to this development. Here, distance from Kyoto and recurring struggles over provincial authority created opportunities for powerful mounted warriors to establish themselves. As early as the 10th century, the revolt of Taira no Masakato demonstrated how formidable a regional warrior leader could become when local military networks turned against the central government. Masakato was defeated in 940, but the warriors who fought both for and against him did not disappear when the rebellion ended. Families descended from figures involved in these conflicts remained prominent, while later wars in northeastern Japan further strengthened relationships between military leaders and provincial followers. For the court, these men could be extremely useful. Aristocratic politics had never been entirely peaceful, but during the 12th century disputes within the ruling elite increasingly drew warriors into conflicts near the capital itself. Retired emperors, reigning emperors, Fujiwara factions, temples, and competing court interests all had reasons to seek military allies. Warriors who had once seemed most at home on distant estates were consequently pulled closer to the highest levels of national politics. The change became unmistakable in 1156. That year, a succession struggle within the imperial family helped produce the Hojin conflict, in which rival factions supported competing members of the dynasty and settled the dispute through armed fighting in Kyoto. Among the warriors involved were men from both the Taira and the Minamoto houses. Only a few years later, another struggle, the Heiji conflict of 1159 and 1160, again brought violence into the political heart of the country. A Buddhist cleric named Yen, writing in the early 13th century and looking back upon the transformation he had witnessed, regarded the conflict of 1156 as a dividing line. With the fighting of that year, he believed Japan had entered an age shaped by warriors. His judgment reflected the experience of a courtly elite watching military families move from the edges of politics toward its center. One warrior benefited from this transformation more than any other. Taira no Kiyomori emerged from the struggles of the 1150s as the head of an increasingly powerful military house. His rise is sometimes described as though a warrior simply forced his way into an aristocratic government. In practice, Kiyomori mastered the existing political order remarkably well. He cultivated relationships with the imperial establishment, received elevated court offices, arranged advantageous marriages, placed relatives in important positions, and built a network capable of operating within both military and aristocratic society. In 1160, he entered the highest ranks of court society as a warrior courtier, and his advancement continued from there. The Taira also benefited from economic opportunities extending beyond the traditional landholding system. Maritime connections with Song China were expanding during the 12th century, bringing imported goods and Chinese copper currency into Japan. The Taira developed strong interests in this overseas commerce, particularly through routes connecting Kyushu with the Asian mainland. Trade did not create their political dominance on its own, but it added another source of wealth and influence to a family already deeply embedded in the machinery of government. By the 1170s, Kiyomori had reached a position extraordinary for the descendant of a provincial warrior family. Members of the Taira occupied important offices. Their marriage connections reached the imperial house. In 1180, Kiyomori's young grandson became Emperor Ontoku, giving the Taira an intimacy with the throne that echoed the marriage politics through which older aristocratic families had exercised power. Kiyomori had not destroyed the Heian political world and replaced it with a warrior government. He had brought his warrior family inside that world and learned to dominate much of it. And that success created enemies. Families excluded from the advancement resented Taira influence. Rival warriors had reasons to oppose them. Members of the imperial family themselves disagreed over succession and political control. The surviving Minamoto had suffered heavily during the conflicts that brought Kiyomori to prominence, and some had been killed while others were scattered or sent into exile. One of those exiles was a boy named Minamoto no Yoritomo, who had been spared after the Heiji conflict and sent east to the province of Izu. For years, Yoritomo seemed to represent a defeated cause. Then, in 1180, Prince Mokuhito, a son of the retired Emperor Go Shirakawa, issued a call for opposition to Taira power. The rebellion surrounding him was quickly defeated, and Mokuhito himself was killed. Yet his appeal reached men who had their own grievances against the Taira, including Minamoto survivors who had spent decades away from the center of power. Yoritomo answered from the east. What followed would become the Genpei War, although neither side entered it knowing that 5 years of conflict would end an entire political age. The Taira still possessed influence at court, military resources, imperial connections, and the prestige of a family that had climbed higher than any warrior house before it. The Minamoto were divided among different leaders whose loyalties and ambitions did not always align. But the conditions beneath them had changed. Generations of provincial warriors had developed their own lands, relationships, grievances, and expectations. Court factions had repeatedly relied upon their military strength. Kiyomori had demonstrated that warriors could reach the highest levels of government, while the wars of the previous decades had made armed forces difficult to separate from national politics. The old order had helped create the men who were now about to fight for control of it. And in the eastern provinces, Minamoto no Yoritomo would begin building something that even victory in Kyoto could no longer contain. When Minamoto no Yoritomo answered Prince Mokuhito's call to arms in 1180, he did so from a position that hardly suggested he was about to become the most important warrior in Japan. He had spent roughly 20 years in exile in Izu, watched by men connected to the Taira. Far from the political world his family had once hoped to influence. His father had been killed after the Heiji conflict, his relatives had been scattered, and the Taira had spent the intervening decades placing themselves at the center of imperial politics. Yet Yoritomo had not been forgotten. His Minamoto ancestry still mattered among Eastern warriors, and his years in Izu had given him time to develop relationships with provincial families whose own concerns reached well beyond old loyalty to his house. Some possessed grievances against Taira officials or their allies. Others saw an opportunity to strengthen claims to land and office. Many were accustomed to making practical calculations about which patron could best protect their interests. Yoritomo's rebellion offered them a cause around which those calculations could gather. His first attempt nearly ended the story before it had properly begun. In September 1180, Yoritomo led a small force against a local Taira supporter and then confronted a larger enemy army at the Battle of Ishibashiyama. The Minamoto force was defeated. Yoritomo fled through the mountains and eventually escaped across the water to the Boso Peninsula. For a rebel who had only just declared himself, the defeat was severe. But his position improved almost as soon as he survived it. Warriors from eastern families began joining him in greater numbers. Among the most important were the Chiba and Kazusa, while his connection to the Hojo family through his wife Masako gave him another valuable network. By the time Yoritomo crossed back into the region around Sagami, his following had grown dramatically. His destination was Kamakura. The choice would shape Japanese history. Kamakura lay in a naturally defensible position, bordered by hills and facing Sagami Bay. More importantly, it sat within the eastern world from which much of Yoritomo's military support came. Kyoto remained the center of imperial legitimacy, but Yoritomo did not immediately rush west in search of it. Instead, he established himself among the warriors whose loyalty would form the basis of his power. That decision helps explain the difference between Yoritomo and several other Minamoto leaders who had entered the war. The struggle against the Taira was never simply one organized Minamoto army advancing under a single commander. Members of the wider Minamoto lineage rose in different regions, sometimes pursuing their own ambitions. Yoritomo's cousin Minamoto no Yoshinaga, for example, developed an independent following in central Japan. Yoritomo's younger half-brothers, Yoshitsune and Noriyori, would later command armies in his name. Their successes mattered enormously, but Yoritomo's most enduring achievement was being built behind the armies, in the relationships connecting Kamakura to its followers. While the Eastern Rebellion grew, the Taira faced troubles of their own. Kiyomori was aging, and the family's dominance at court had generated years of resentment. The decision to move the imperial capital temporarily from Kyoto to Fukuhara in 1180 created further disruption and was soon abandoned. War damaged the government's ability to collect resources, while famine struck large parts of eastern and central Japan during the early 1180s. These hardships were not produced by the conflict alone, but they made prolonged warfare more difficult for everyone involved. Then, in 1181, Taira no Kiyomori died. The Taira remained powerful after his death, but they had lost the figure who had done more than anyone else to assemble their political network. Fighting continued without an immediate decisive outcome. Yoritomo remained in the east, consolidating his authority. Elsewhere, Minamoto no Yoshinaga advanced toward the capital. In 1183, Yoshinaka's forces defeated a major Taira army at Kurikara. The Taira position in Kyoto became increasingly difficult to maintain. Rather than allow themselves to be trapped in the capital, they withdrew westward, taking with them the young Emperor Ontaku and several other imperial regalia associated with the legitimacy of the throne. Their departure created an unusual situation. Kyoto had been recovered from Taira control, but the war had not ended. Ontoku remained with the Taira, while the retired emperor Go Shirakawa stayed behind. Another child, Ontoku's half-brother, was soon placed on the throne as Emperor Go-Toba. For a time, Japan effectively had rival imperial courts, one in Kyoto and another traveling with the Taira. Yoshinaga might have expected his capture of the capital to establish him as the dominant Minamoto leader. Instead, his relationship with the court deteriorated. His troops were difficult to control, supplies around Kyoto were strained, and his ambitions brought him into conflict with Go Shirakawa. They also brought him into conflict with Yoritomo. By remaining in the east, Yoritomo had built an organization capable of surviving the fortunes of individual campaigns. Yoshinaga had won his way into Kyoto, but possession of the capital did not automatically translate into control over the Minamoto cause. When Yoritomo sent forces west, under his brothers Noriyori and Yoshitsune, the dispute between the two Minamoto branches turned violent. Early in 1184, Yoshinaga was defeated and killed. The road was now open for Yoritomo's commanders to turn their attention toward the Taira. The campaign that followed produced some of the most famous episodes in Japanese military literature. At Ichi-no-Tani, near modern Kobe, Taira forces were attacked and defeated in February 1184. Later accounts turned parts of the battle into scenes of individual courage and tragedy, preserving the names of warriors whose deaths came to represent the passing of the old courtly world. Such stories would eventually find their most influential form in the tale of the Haika, a work shaped by oral performance and later literary composition, rather than written as a modern history of the war. Its famous concern with impermanence suited the fate of a family that had risen to extraordinary heights and then disappeared with remarkable speed. The surviving Taira continued westward. Yoshitsune followed. In early 1185, he struck the Taira position at Yashima on Shikoku, forcing another retreat. The conflict was being pushed steadily toward the western edge of the inland sea, where the Taira still possessed ships, allies, and familiarity with maritime warfare. Their final refuge was no longer a great political center. It was a moving court sustained aboard vessels and defended by a family whose power had once reached into nearly every corner of government. The last major encounter came at Danonura on April 25, 1185. The battle unfolded in the narrow waters of the Shimonoseki Strait between Honshu and Kyushu. Taira and Minamoto fleets fought in conditions shaped by tides, local knowledge, shifting loyalties, and the difficulty of commanding large numbers of vessels in a confined channel. Later tradition supplied the engagement with heroic episodes and dramatic betrayals, and separating literary memory from recoverable events is not always simple. What is clear is that the fighting ended in the destruction of the Taira power. As defeat became unavoidable, members of the Taira court chose death rather than capture. The child Emperor Ontoku, only a few years old, died in the water with his grandmother. Numerous Taira nobles and warriors followed. Others were captured. The imperial sword, one of the sacred regalia carried west with Ontoku, was said to have been lost beneath the strait, although traditions concerning the regalia developed in complicated ways afterward. With Danonura, the Taira regime collapsed. The war had brought extraordinary destruction to a political order that only a few years earlier had seemed fully under Taira control. Kiyomori was dead. His family had lost the capital, their emperor, their armies, and much of the political network through which they had governed. Minamoto commanders had won the battles that destroyed them. But victory immediately created another problem. Yoshitsune had emerged from the Western campaigns as one of the celebrated warriors of the age. His speed, tactical daring, and role in the victories at Ichi-no-Tani, Yashima, and Danonura would later make him one of the great tragic figures of Japanese memory. Yet the qualities that made him valuable during the war did not necessarily make him safe within the political system Yoritomo was constructing. Yoritomo required his followers to understand where their authority came from. A warrior who accepted appointments independently from the imperial court, cultivated his own fame, or developed loyalties outside Kamakura, threatened the discipline on which Yoritomo's network depended. Yoshitsune's relationship with the court, particularly his acceptance of office without Yoritomo's approval, deepened the suspicion between the brothers. Their break came soon after the war. Yoshitsune attempted to resist Yoritomo, failed to gather enough support, and fled. For several years, he moved beyond his brother's reach, before seeking protection in northern Honshu with the powerful Fujiwara family of Hiraizume. Even there, he could not remain secure indefinitely. In 1189, under pressure from Yoritomo, Fujiwara no Yoshira turned against him. Yoshitsune died, and Yoritomo then sent an army north, destroying the northern Fujiwara regime later that same year. By then, the military geography of Japan had changed profoundly. The Taira were gone. Yoshinaga was gone. Yoshitsune was gone. The northern Fujiwara had been destroyed. One after another, alternative centers of warrior power had disappeared, while Yoritomo remained in Kamakura. His survival was not the result of battlefield brilliance alone. During much of the most celebrated fighting, he had remained hundreds of miles away from it. From the east, he had spent the war turning personal allegiance into administration. Warriors who pledged themselves to him looked to Kamakura for recognition of their claims and protection of their interests. Disputes came before his officials. Rewards could be granted to loyal followers. Military service was tied increasingly to a relationship with Yoritomo himself. The conflict therefore ended with something more consequential than one warrior family replacing another. Kiyomori had demonstrated how far a military house could rise within the existing courtly system. Yoritomo had begun creating a political structure capable of operating alongside that system from somewhere else entirely. Kyoto still had its emperor. Its aristocrats still possessed estates, offices, tradition, and immense cultural prestige. Temples remained wealthy. The machinery of the older state had not vanished. No one standing in 1185 could announce that imperial government had ended and military government had begun. What had appeared instead was a second center of authority. It stood in Kamakura, surrounded by the eastern warriors who had carried Yoritomo from a defeated exile to the most powerful military figure in Japan. The war had given him the opportunity. He would spend the years that followed making certain that victory became something more durable than conquest. By the time Minamoto no Yoritomo's armies destroyed the northern Fujiwara in 1189, there was no longer a serious military rival capable of challenging his authority across Japan. The Taira had vanished as a political force. Yoshinaga had died during the Genpei War. Yoshitsune was dead as well, and the independent power of Hiraizumi had been broken. Yoritomo had won. Yet the government that would emerge from his victory could not be built by declaring himself ruler. Japan already possessed an emperor, a capital, provincial offices, aristocratic families, temples, estates, tax arrangements, legal traditions, and generations of political custom. Yoritomo had neither the ability nor much reason to sweep all of this aside. Many of the institutions centered upon Kyoto continued functioning after 1185, and the imperial court retained enormous importance as a source of legitimacy. What Yoritomo created developed alongside that older order. The distinction is important because later centuries can make the beginning of the shogunate appear cleaner than it actually was. Japan did not wake one morning to discover that the emperor had stopped governing and the shogun had taken his place. Authority accumulated around Kamakura through a series of practical arrangements. Yoritomo needed to control his followers, protect their interests, reward their service, settle their disputes, and ensure that military obligations could be enforced across a country whose existing institutions remained very much alive. The result was less a replacement government than a new layer of government built around the warrior class, and at its center stood Kamakura. The settlement Yoritomo had chosen during the Genpei War was well suited to the political world he was creating. Mountains enclosed much of the surrounding landscape, while Sugami Bay opened toward the sea. Narrow approaches through the hills could be defended, and Kamakura lay far from the aristocratic environment of Kyoto. Yet distance did not mean isolation. Yoritomo could govern his eastern followers from the region where his support was strongest, while continuing to negotiate with the imperial court hundreds of miles away. He also gave the new center a religious identity closely connected with his family. In 1180, Yoritomo established the great shrine of Shuraguoka Hachimangu at its present location in Kamakura. Hachiman had long associations with warfare and with the Minamoto house, and the shrine became one of the defining institutions of the city. The road leading toward it helped organize Kamakura's physical landscape, while ceremonies there connected the authority of Yoritomo's household with a sacred protector claimed by generations of Minamoto warriors. Around this political and religious center grew residences, offices, temples, roads, markets, and the households of the men who served the new regime. Kamakura would never reproduce Kyoto. The imperial capital possessed centuries of accumulated prestige and remained the home of an aristocratic culture that warriors themselves continued to admire. Yoritomo was not attempting to create a society purified of courtly influence. His government needed literate administrators, legal expertise, religious institutions, and cultural legitimacy as much as it needed mounted warriors. The men who provided its military foundation were known as gokanin, usually translated as housemen or direct vassals. Their relationship with Yoritomo had been forged during war, but peace changed what that relationship required. A warrior might owe military service and personal loyalty to Yoritomo while expecting something tangible in return. That could mean confirmation of rights over land, appointment to an office, protection against rivals, or a judgment supporting his claim in a dispute. The arrangement was personal enough to retain the character of lordship, yet widespread enough that it required administration. This was one of Yoritomo's central achievements. He gave warriors reasons to bring their disputes to Kamakura, rather than resolving every conflict locally through influence or force. A surviving order from 1187 shows the process in remarkably ordinary terms. 2 men disputed possession of a Gito office in Hizen province. Yoritomo's government investigated the competing claims, decided that one was justified, and confirmed the successful claimant in the position. The document also recognized continuing obligations to the estate's proprietor. Even in a case where Kamakura intervened directly, older property rights did not simply disappear beneath warrior authority. That overlap would characterize much of early Kamakura government. The office involved in the dispute, the Gito, became one of the most important tools available to Yoritomo. Usually described as estate stewards, Gito could be responsible for duties involving land management, the collection of revenues, policing, and the protection of interests connected with the warrior government. Their precise authority differed according to place and circumstance, and they often operated within estates where aristocrats, temples, or other proprietors retained rights of their own. This meant that a Gito did not necessarily replace an existing landowner. Instead, another figure had been inserted into an already complicated structure of authority. For Yoritomo, that was useful. A follower appointed to an estate gained a position from which he could sustain himself and his household. Kamakura gained a loyal man with a recognized role in the locality. The older proprietor might continue receiving income while now dealing with a warrior official whose authority ultimately rested upon Yoritomo. The arrangement could also generate disputes, and it frequently did. Gito might push beyond the rights granted to them. Estate proprietors could complain about withheld revenues or interference. Local disagreements could become cases requiring judgment from Kamakura. Yet even the conflicts helped draw warriors toward the new government, because every dispute brought another question before the institutions developing around Yoritomo. Above this local level stood another important office, the Shugo. Shugo are often translated as military governors or constables. Their early responsibilities centered upon matters such as policing serious crimes, supervising military obligations, and organizing Yoritomo's followers within the provinces. Like the Gito, they existed alongside older provincial institutions rather than immediately replacing them. A province could therefore contain officials connected with Kyoto, state authorities within their own rights, and warriors responsible for Kamakura. To someone accustomed to a modern state, this could appear hopelessly tangled. To medieval Japan, overlapping authority was familiar. The innovation was that Yoritomo had created a network through which warriors scattered across those older jurisdictions could be connected directly to a military government based in the east. Columbia's collection of Kamakura documents identifies the Gito and Shugo as central mechanisms through which the new regime maintained order while operating within the continuing framework of the imperial state. The opportunity to extend these appointments expanded dramatically after the Taira defeat. In late 1185, Yoritomo obtained court approval allowing him to place military officials in provinces and on estates as part of the effort to capture Yoshitsune and maintain order. The immediate justification was connected to the political crisis surrounding his fugitive brother, but the consequences reached much further. The search for Yoshitsune helped legitimize a wider presence for Yoritomo's followers. Once again, a short-term problem produced a lasting institution. Yoritomo's relationship with Yoshitsune therefore mattered for more than the tragedy later attached to the brothers. Yoshitsune had accepted titles from the court without Yoritomo's approval and had become connected to political interests outside his brother's direct control. From Yoritomo's perspective, the issue touched the central principle on which Kamakura depended. His followers could not serve two competing military patrons whenever it suited them. The court might grant rank, the emperor might confer titles, aristocratic culture would continue to shape elite life. Yoritomo himself sought recognition from Kyoto. But military loyalty had led back to Kamakura. His handling of the imperial court reflected the same practical calculation. Retired Emperor Go Shirakawa was an experienced political operator who had survived repeated changes in fortune, including the rise of the Kiyomori and the Genpei War itself. Yoritomo could not treat him as though the old imperial establishment had become irrelevant. The two sides instead negotiated within a political environment in which each possessed things the other needed. The court possessed legitimacy, titles, and established administrative traditions. Yoritomo possessed military power. For several years after 1185, that relationship remained uneasy. Go Shirakawa could still frustrate Yoritomo, as his dealings with Yoshitsune demonstrated. Yoritomo, for his part, steadily strengthened his ability to act without requiring constant intervention from Kyoto. When Go Shirakawa died in 1192, one of the remaining obstacles to Yoritomo's formal elevation disappeared. Later that year, the court appointed him Sheitai Shogun. The title is usually shortened simply to Shogun. It had existed long before Yoritomo, and had originally been associated with military commands issued on behalf of the imperial government. Yoritomo did not invent the word, and his government had not been waiting helplessly for the title before it could function. By 1192, Kamakura had already spent years judging disputes, rewarding followers, placing officials, and organizing warrior society. Columbia's overview accordingly dates the functioning of the Kamakura Bakufu from 1185, while the Metropolitan Museum notes Yoritomo's formal appointment as shogun in 1192. The appointment nevertheless mattered. It gave an established imperial title to the military supremacy Yoritomo had already created. The court was recognizing a warrior whose authority did not depend upon living in Kyoto or personally controlling the imperial household. His political center remained in Kamakura. From there, the outlines of a new arrangement could be seen. The emperor continued to reign in Kyoto. Court nobles continued to hold offices and estates. Religious institutions remained powerful landholders. Provincial administration did not vanish. Yoritomo's Bakufu governed most directly through its relationship with warriors, particularly the Gokunin who depended upon Kamakura for protection, judgment, and reward. Its reach was therefore substantial without being uniform. That made early Kamakura government different from the centralized military dictatorship the the word shogunate can sometimes suggest to a modern listener. Yoritomo had not conquered every institution in Japan. He had made himself increasingly difficult for any of them to govern without. The difference can be seen in the work performed by his administration. Cases involving land were heard. Warrior appointments were confirmed. Service was demanded. Criminal matters involving his followers could be investigated. Records had to be kept, precedents remembered, and decisions communicated across long distances. The new military elites consequently needed men capable of doing far more than fighting. Even the cultural life of Kamakura reflected this reality. Yoritomo had been raised within a world where courtly accomplishment carried prestige, and the emerging Bakufu drew upon people familiar with aristocratic and religious learning. Later warrior governments would continue negotiating between Bu, the martial accomplishments expected of warriors, and Bun, the literary, administrative, and cultural accomplishments required of rulers. The first shogunate already contained the beginning of that balance. Yoritomo himself never had long to enjoy the completed form of what he had built. In 1195, he traveled to Kyoto, where his position could be displayed in the very capital whose politics had once destroyed his family. The visit revealed how far circumstances had changed since his exile. He was no longer the surviving son of a defeated Minamoto rebel. He arrived as the acknowledged leader of a military network extending across Japan. Yet his authority remained intensely personal. The Gokunin had sworn loyalty to Yoritomo. The institutions of Kamakura had developed under his supervision. Rival Minamoto leaders had been removed one after another, leaving his household at the center of the new warrior order. This had helped him establish control, but it also created a question that victory had postponed. What happened when Yoritomo was no longer there? In 1199, Minamoto no Yoritomo died at the age of 51. Accounts of his final illness and the circumstances surrounding it became embellished in later tradition, and the surviving evidence does not allow every detail to be reconstructed confidently. What mattered politically was immediate and unmistakable. The man who had held together Kamakura's network of personal loyalty, military authority, court recognition, and administrative power was gone. His eldest surviving son, Yori, succeeded him. On paper, this appeared to preserve the Minamoto shogunate Yoritomo had created. A father had established the military government, and his son would inherit it. But Yoritomo had spent much of his career preventing other warriors from acquiring independent power. He had never created a dynasty of experienced adult successors around himself. Yori was still young, and the men surrounding him included veteran warriors and relatives who had accumulated influence during his father's rule. Among the most important were the family of Yoritomo's widow. Hojo Masako had been beside Yoritomo since his years of exile. Her father, Hojo Takemasa, had supported the rebellion that carried him out of Izu. Her brothers and relatives had become deeply embedded in the political world of Kamakura. Yoritomo had created a government capable of surviving the destruction of the Taira, the death of Yoshitsune, and the disappearance of every major military rival who had challenged him. It was now about to face a more difficult test: how to survive without its founder. Minamoto no Yoritomo had spent nearly 2 decades gathering authority into his own hands. When he died in 1199, that concentration of power became the first great weakness of the government he left behind. His eldest surviving son, Minamoto no Yori, was 18 years old. He possessed the lineage required to succeed his father, and had grown up within the warrior government Yoritomo created. What he did not possess was Yoritomo's personal relationship with the men who had built it. Many of Kamakura's leading warriors had followed Yoritomo when he was still in exile struggling to survive. They had fought through the Genpei War, watched rival branches of the Minamoto disappear, and received lands, appointments, and judgments from the founder of the Bakufu. Their loyalty to Yoritomo had been strengthened by years of shared experience and mutual obligation. Yori inherited their service without inheriting those memories. The problem appeared quickly. Only a few months after Yoritomo's death, 13 senior members of the warrior government formed a council that restricted the young shogun's ability to decide important matters independently. Among them were some of the most experienced figures in Kamakura, including members of the Hojo family. The arrangement demonstrated something that Yoritomo's personal authority had partly concealed. The shogunate already contained powerful families with interests of their own. Yori's mother belonged to one of them. Hojo Masako had known Yoritomo before there was a Kamakura shogunate. She was the daughter of Hojo Tokimasa, a warrior of Izu who had initially been entrusted with watching the exiled Minamoto heir. According to later accounts, Masako and Yoritomo formed their relationship despite opposition from her family, and when Yoritomo finally rebelled against the Taira in 1180, the Hojo joined him. The decision transformed the fortunes of the family. Tokimasa became one of Yoritomo's important supporters. Masako became Yoritomo's wife and eventually the mother of his heirs. Other members of the Hojo entered the administration surrounding Kamakura. Their importance therefore rested upon something more durable than simply being related to the shogun. They had participated in the regime from its beginning. After Yoritomo's death, Masako became a Buddhist nun, as was customary for many widowed women of her status. She shaved her head and formally withdrew from ordinary married life. But retirement from the household did not mean retirement from politics. For the next quarter century, Masako would remain deeply involved in the survival of the government her husband had created. Later generations remembered her as the Ama shogun, or the nun shogun. The name captures something real about her influence, although she never formally held the office of shogun. Her authority was exercised through family relationships, political alliances, interventions in crises, and her unique position as Yoritomo's widow and the mother of his successors. In a political culture where lineage and household connections mattered enormously, those relationships could carry considerable weight. They also placed Masako in a painful position when conflicts developed around her own children. Yori's brief government became entangled in factional struggles almost immediately. One of the strongest families around him was the Hiki, whose connections to Yori were especially close. Hiki Yoshikazu had become influential partly through family ties to the young shogun, and Yori's wife was Yoshikazu's daughter. Their son Ichiman was therefore both Yori's heir and Hiki Yokikazu's grandson. For the Hojo, the arrangement threatened to push the family away from the center of power, and the resulting struggle was not an abstract contest between institutions. It unfolded among people connected by marriage and blood. Yuri's mother was a Hojo. His wife was a Hiki. His child connected the Minamoto shogunal line directly to the Hiki household. Behind those relationships stood armed retainers capable of turning a family dispute to a political purge. In 1203, Yuri became seriously ill. Believing that the shogun might die, the leading figures around Kamakura began considering how authority and inheritance should be divided. The details survive primarily through chronicles compiled later, especially the Azuma Kagami, and those accounts have to be handled carefully. The chronicle was produced within the political world shaped by Hojo rule and cannot be treated as a neutral transcript of every event it describes. The broad outcome, however, is clear. Hojo Tokimasa moved against Hiki Yoshikazu. Yoshikazu was summoned and killed. Hojo forces attacked the Hiki residence, destroying the family's political power. Yuri's young son Ichiman also died amid the violence, although surviving accounts differ in some of their details concerning precisely when and how. Yuri did not die from his illness. When he recovered enough to understand what had happened, his political position had already collapsed. He was removed as shogun and sent to Shuzenji in Izu. In 1204, he was killed there. He was still only in his early 20s. The office now passed to his younger brother, Minamoto Sanetomo. Sanetomo was around 11 years old. The succession solved one immediate problem while revealing how much the office itself had changed. Yoritomo had ruled because he possessed both the title and the military network beneath it. His sons possessed the title, while senior figures around them controlled the machinery of government. Hojo Tokimasa became Shikin, usually translated as regent to the shogun. The office would become one of the defining institutions of Kamakura politics. At first glance, the arrangement seems peculiar. Japan already had an emperor whose authority existed alongside that of a shogun. Now the shogun himself had a regent. Political authority could therefore pass through several layers before reaching the people actually making decisions. Yet these layers were part of the system's strength as well as its complexity. The Hojo did not need to abolish the shogunate in order to dominate it. In fact, doing so would have destroyed an office whose legitimacy remained useful. The shogun could stand at the symbolic center of a warrior government, while the Hojo managed affairs around him. Their own authority depended partly upon preserving the political structure established by Yoritomo. Tokimasa would soon discover that even the Hojo could not control Kamakura without limits. By 1205, another factional struggle had developed, this time involving Tokimasa himself. His second wife, Maki no Kata, and her relatives became associated with an attempt to remove Sanetomo and elevate a different candidate to shogunate. Masako and her brother Hojo Yoshitoki opposed the plan. The confrontation ended with Tokimasa being forced from power and sent into religious retirement. It was an important moment. The first Hojo regent had helped destroy the Hiki, remove one shogun, and place another in office. Yet when his own ambitions threatened the arrangement that Masako and Yoshitoki were trying to preserve, his children turned against him. Hojo Yoshitoki succeeded his father as the dominant figure within the Bakufu. Under Yoshitoki, the regency began to develop into something more stable than the personal dominance of Tokimasa. Kamakura remained filled with powerful warrior families, and several would suffer violent destruction during the early 13th century. The Hachiekiyama had already been eliminated in the struggle surrounding Tokimasa's fall. Other rivals would follow. The Hojo did not emerge as unquestioned rulers overnight. Their dominance grew through a long and often dangerous process of alliance, office holding, marriage, and the removal of competing houses. At the center of this political world stood Sanetomo. His life developed very differently from that of his father. Yoritomo had built his reputation through rebellion, military organization, and political calculation. Sanetomo had been a child when made shogun, and never commanded the warrior government with comparable independence. Instead, he developed a strong interest in the aristocratic culture of Kyoto. He studied poetry and became an accomplished waka poet. His surviving work eventually formed the collection known as the Kinkai Wakashu. Sanetomo cultivated connections with the imperial court and received high court rank, embracing precisely the cultural world that a simplistic story of samurai replacing aristocrats might lead us to expect him to reject. But Kamakura's warriors did not reject Kyoto's culture. Court rank remained prestigious. Poetry mattered. Aristocratic customs influenced elite behavior. The new warrior government had grown alongside the imperial order, and its leaders could admire the culture of Kyoto while guarding their own political authority from it. Sanetomo embodied that overlap particularly clearly. He was the head of a warrior government who preferred cultural pursuits to battlefield command. A Minamoto shogun whose actual political freedom was limited by his Hojo relatives, and an increasingly distinguished court figure living in a city created to provide an alternative center of warrior power. His position might have continued for many years, but instead, on a winter evening in 1219, the direct Minamoto shogunal line came to an abrupt end. Sanetomo had reached the highest court rank yet granted to a warrior of his generation. A ceremony marking his appointment as Minister of the Right was held at Suragooka Hachimangu, the great shrine associated with his family and with the political identity of Kamakura itself. After the ceremony, Sanetomo descended the shrine steps. Waiting for him was his nephew Kugyo. Kugyo was the son of the deposed Shogun Yori. After his father's fall, he had entered religious life and eventually became a senior figure at Suragooka Hachimangu. Whatever combination of personal grievance and political ambition motivated him, the result was unmistakable. Kugyo attacked and killed Sanetomo. He then claimed that as the son of Yori, he should succeed the shogunate. Within hours, Kugyo himself was killed. Sanetomo had no surviving child. Yori's male line offered no viable successor. Yoritomo's direct line was finished. For the second time in 20 years, Kamakura faced a crisis that could easily have destroyed a political system built around the authority of the Minamoto house. Yet the response to Sanetomo's death demonstrated just how far the Bakufu had developed since 1199. The government did in fact not collapse. The Hojo did not attempt to claim the shogunal line for themselves either. Their family possessed enormous practical authority, but they lacked the kind of lineage that made an openly Hojo shogunate politically attractive. Instead, Kamakura looked toward the aristocratic families of Kyoto for a replacement. After negotiations with the imperial court, the young Kujo Yoritsune was eventually brought to Kamakura. He belonged to the prestigious Fujiwara lineage and had a distant connection to Yoritomo's family. In 1226, he formally received the title of shogun. The solution revealed how thoroughly the nature of the office had changed. The shogun no longer needed to be a Minamoto military leader who personally commanded the Eastern warriors. He could be an aristocratic child brought from Kyoto to occupy the position while the Hojo regents governed around him. The office remained important because the system surrounding it required a legitimate center, but the person holding it no longer had to possess Yoritomo's power. That distinction helps explain why the Kamakura Shogunate survived the extinction of its founding dynasty. Yoritomo's greatest achievement had turned out to be something he may never have fully intended. He had created institutions strong enough to survive the disappearance of his own descendants. Yet in 1219, that survival was not assured. The imperial court had watched the struggles inside Kamakura closely. The Minamoto line had ended. The Hojo now governed through an office occupied by others. Two political figures in Kyoto, the situation could suggest that the military government was vulnerable. Among those watching was the retired Emperor Go-Toba. Go-Toba had been placed on the throne during the Genpei War, while Emperor Ontaku was still traveling with the Taira. He had lived through the destruction of that family, Yoritomo's rise, the creation of the shogunate, and the troubled succession of Yoritomo's sons. By the time Sanetomo was assassinated, Go-Toba had accumulated considerable political experience and had little reason to regard Hojo dominance as a natural or permanent feature of Japanese government. The Hojo had survived every internal struggle placed before them, but their next challenge would come from the institution whose authority the shogunate had never formally abolished, the imperial court itself. The death of Minamoto no Sanetomo in 1219 left the Kamakura shogunate in an unusual position. The government created by Yoritomo had survived the deaths of both of his sons, but the family that gave the regime its original legitimacy could no longer provide another shogun. The Hojo controlled much of the machinery of the government without claiming the highest office themselves, and negotiations over Sanetomo's replacement immediately exposed the continuing importance of the imperial court. For retired Emperor Go-Toba, the moment offered an opportunity. Go-Toba had spent almost his entire life amid the political changes that produced the Kamakura government. He had become emperor in 1183, while still a small child, after the Taira fled Kyoto with Emperor Ontaku during the Genpei War. Because the Taira had taken the imperial regalia with them, Go-Toba's accession had occurred under extraordinary circumstances. He remained emperor until 1198, when he abdicated in favor of his son and began exercising authority as a retired emperor. Abdication did not necessarily mean political retirement in medieval Japan. The system commonly called insei, or cloistered government, had allowed retired emperors to remain important political actors for generations before the Kamakura period. Go-Toba followed that tradition. He maintained his own court and estates, participated actively in cultural and religious life, and cultivated connections with warriors as well as aristocrats. He was also a figure of considerable cultural accomplishment. Go-Toba wrote poetry, sponsored poetic gatherings, and played an important role in the creation of the Shinko Kinshu, one of the great imperial anthologies of Japanese verse. He practiced archery and horsemanship and took an interest in martial pursuits unusual enough to matter when considering his later confrontation with Kamakura. He was not simply an isolated court aristocrat who failed to understand the warrior world developing around him. For years, Go-Toba and the Bakufu managed an uneasy coexistence. Neither could simply ignore the other. Kamakura exercised growing authority over its warrior followers and maintained officials throughout much of the country, but the imperial court remained the source of titles and formal legitimacy. Kyoto still contained aristocratic institutions that governed large areas of social and economic life. Powerful temples and shrines retained extensive estates. Bakufu itself had developed within this older political framework rather than replacing it. The arrangement depended upon negotiation. Sanetomo had helped make that possible. His fascination with court culture and his willingness to pursue elevated imperial rank gave Kyoto a shogun with whom it could maintain a recognizable political relationship. His assassination removed that intermediary. The disagreement over his replacement came almost immediately. Kamakura wanted a successor possessing sufficiently prestigious ancestry to occupy the shogunal office. The Hojo initially hoped to obtain an imperial prince, which would have placed a member of the imperial family at the symbolic head of the warrior government. Go-Toba refused. Eventually, the Bakufu turned instead toward the Fujiwara aristocracy. The child, Kujo Yoritsune, was selected, although he would not formally receive the title of shogun until several years later. But behind the succession dispute stood a larger question. The Hojo were governing a military organization whose formal leader was becoming increasingly symbolic. Go-Toba, meanwhile, belonged to a political institution whose direct control over the provinces had weakened, but whose legitimacy remained deeply embedded in Japanese government. Both systems could continue existing together, as they had for decades, yet their jurisdictions overlapped. Their supporters possessed competing interests, and neither arrangement had settled permanently which side should prevail when serious disagreement arose. Land disputes sharpened these tensions. The court, aristocratic houses, temples, shrines, and warriors all possessed claims to estates. Jito, appointed through Kamakura, could come into conflict with older proprietors over revenues and local authority. Every dispute had the potential to become a question about jurisdiction. Was a warrior accountable primarily to the proprietor whose estate he helped administer, to the courtly institution behind that proprietor, or to the Bakufu that had confirmed his position? Yoritomo had spent years making sure that the answer, whenever his own followers were concerned, pointed toward Kamakura. Go-Toba had reasons to resist that trend. By 1221, the relationship had deteriorated beyond negotiation. Hoyo Yoshitoki now stood at the center of the Bakufu. He had succeeded his father as shogunal regent, survived the struggles surrounding Yuri and Sanetomo, and helped preserve the military government after the extinction of Yoritomo's direct line. If Go-Toba intended to weaken Hojo control, Yoshitoki was the obvious target. The retired emperor did not initially declare war against the entire warrior class, or even formally against the institution of the shogunate. His challenge was directed against Yoshitoki. In the 5th month of 1221, Go-Toba issued commands calling for Yoshitoki's overthrow. The distinction was politically useful. If the conflict could be presented as an imperial order against a rebellious subject, Warriors serving Kamakura might decide that obedience to the emperor outweighed loyalty to the Hojo. Go-Toba had cultivated relationships with warriors of his own, and he appears to have expected significant defections once imperial authority was openly invoked. For a moment, the calculation was plausible. The Hojo were not Minamoto. They had gained control through marriage, regency, political maneuvering, and the destruction of rivals. The shogunal office itself was vacant in practical terms, waiting for the young Yoritsune to mature into its formal role. If the Eastern warriors regarded their loyalty as belonging to Yoritomo's family rather than the Hojo administration that survived it, Go-Toba's command could split Kamakura apart. News of the imperial challenge reached the east. The response of Hojo Masako became one of the defining episodes of Kamakura political memory. According to the Azuma Kagami, Masako addressed the assembled Gokanin and reminded them of the benefits they had received from her late husband. Yoritomo had defeated their enemies, secured their positions, recognized their lands, and created the political order under which they now lived. Whatever grievances individual warriors might have against the Hojo, their fortunes had become tied to the survival of Kamakura. The question confronting the warriors was practical as much as emotional. If they abandoned Kamakura, what happened to the rights Kamakura had confirmed? For 40 years, Eastern warriors had relied upon the Bakufu to protect land claims, settle disputes, grant offices, and reward service. Yoritomo's achievement had been to turn those interests into a durable political relationship. Go-Toba was now testing whether that relationship could survive without Yoritomo itself. And survive it did. The expected collapse did not occur. Large numbers of Gokanin rallied to the Hojo. The leaders in Kamakura then faced another decision. They could wait in the east and prepare to defend themselves against whatever forces Go-Toba assembled, or they could carry the conflict directly toward Kyoto. They chose to advance. The decision transformed what might have become a prolonged civil struggle into a rapid campaign. Hojo Yoshitoki's son, Yasutoki, was among those commanding the eastern armies. Bakufu forces moved westward along several routes, gathering additional warriors as they traveled. The scale of the forces described in later chronicles is almost certainly exaggerated, as medieval accounts frequently inflated army sizes. What matters is the speed with which the balance became apparent. Go-Toba had hoped imperial commands would separate warriors from the Hojo. Instead, Kamakura demonstrated that the military relationships built since Yoritomo's rebellion had developed a loyalty of their own. The fighting lasted only about a month. Imperial supporters attempted to defend approaches to Kyoto, including positions along the rivers protecting the capital. Bakufu armies pushed through them, and by the middle of 1221, Kamakura's forces entered Kyoto. Go-Toba's attempt to destroy Hojo Yoshitoki had failed. The consequences were considerably larger than the original challenge. When the Taira had lost the Genpei War, their political order had disappeared. Go-Toba's defeat was different. The Bakufu did not abolish the imperial throne, nor did the Hojo declare themselves kings or attempt to replace the imperial dynasty. Instead, they punished the individuals responsible while leaving the institution intact. Go-Toba was exiled to the Oki Islands in the Sea of Japan, and the reigning emperor, Chukyo, was removed after only a short reign and replaced. For Go-Toba, exile was permanent. The man who had once occupied the center of imperial cultural life spent the remaining years of his life far from Kyoto. He continued writing poetry and maintaining religious practices until his death in 1239. His political defeat would become part of the broader medieval memory of rulers whose attempts to alter the balance of power ended in isolation from the capital they had once governed. For Kamakura, victory created opportunities. Lands belonging to the supporters of Go-Toba could be confiscated and redistributed. Many of these estates were located in western Japan, where the Bakufu's authority had historically been less secure than in the eastern provinces. Loyal warriors received appointments and interests in these territories, carrying the political network of Kamakura into regions where it had previously been weaker. This was one of the most consequential results of the Jokyu War. Yoritomo's original strength had come from the east. His victory in the Genpei War had allowed his government to establish a broader national presence, but the geography of warrior loyalty remained uneven. The failed imperial revolt gave the Hojo both the justification and the confiscated resources needed to deepen their influence in western Japan. Victory also produced a new institution within Kyoto itself. The Bakufu established the Rokuharo Tondai, based in the capital and staffed by senior representatives of Kamakura. From there, officials could supervise Western warriors, gather information, handle judicial matters, and monitor the imperial court. The symbolism was difficult to miss. Before 1221, the imperial court had been able to imagine that Kamakura remained a distant military government, whose authority might be curtailed if the political circumstances were right. After the war, representatives of that military government were permanently stationed inside Kyoto. The relationship between the two centers had changed. This did not make the emperor meaningless. Imperial legitimacy remained fundamental to Japanese political culture. The Hojo continued to govern through the shogunate rather than openly replacing the court. The court retained estates, offices, ceremonies, cultural authority, and important administrative functions. Emperors and retired emperors would continue participating in politics. What disappeared after 1221 was the realistic assumption that the court could simply command the eastern warriors to abandon Kamakura. The Bakufu had survived a direct imperial challenge and demonstrated that the Gokanin regarded their relationship with the military government as something worth defending. That result represented the maturation of the system Yoritomo had begun. In 1180, warriors had gathered around and exiled Minamoto because they believed supporting him could protect or advance their interests. 4 decades later, their descendants and comrades rallied around a government, even though no adult Minamoto shogun remained to lead it. The institution itself had become the source of loyalty. Hojo Masako lived long enough to see that transformation completed. She died in 1225, 4 years after the victory over Go-Toba. Her brother, Yoshitoki, had died the previous year. The generation that had known Yoritomo personally was beginning to disappear. Their deaths raised a quieter version of the same question that had followed Yoritomo's own passing. Could Kamakura continue once the people who had built it were gone? The answer would mostly depend upon administration rather than personal memory. The Bakufu now governed warriors across a wider geographic area than ever before. Confiscated estates created new appointments. Western expansion generated new disputes. Gito and estate proprietors continued arguing over revenues and rights. Gokanin needed judgments that could be understood as predictable rather than arbitrary. the government required procedures that could survive the death of any particular regent. Hojo Yasutoki, Yoshitoki's son, and one of the commanders who had marched against Kyoto in 1221, inherited that problem. His generation had already proven that Kamakura could win a war against the imperial court. The next task was less dramatic, but ultimately just as important. They had to learn how to govern the peace. The armies that returned east after the Jokyu War carried with them the proof that Kamakura could survive a direct challenge from the imperial court. They also returned to a government that had become considerably more complicated because of its victory. New lands had fallen under the influence of the Bakufu. New warriors had received appointments. Kamakura's reach into western Japan had grown, and the Rokuhara Tondai now gave the military government a permanent presence in Kyoto. Every expansion of authority brought another collection of disputes with it. Questions over inheritance, boundaries, revenues, appointments, debts, crimes, and obligations could no longer be settled by remembering what Minamoto no Yoritomo had intended 40 years earlier. The men who had known Yoritomo personally were disappearing. Hojo Yoshitoki died in 1224. His sister Masako followed him the next year. With their deaths, Kamakura lost two of the last great political figures whose authority reached directly back to the founding generation. The government they left behind had survived rebellion, assassination, disputed secessions, the extinction of Yoritomo's direct line, and war against the imperial court. Its next transformation would take place without a comparable crisis. It would come through meetings, petitions, judgments, and written rules. At the center of that transformation stood Hojo Yashitoki. Yashitoki had already spent much of his adult life inside the government he now inherited. Born in 1183 while the Genpei War was still underway, he belonged to the first generation of Hojo leaders to grow up alongside the Kamakura regime rather than before it. His grandfather Tokimasa had supported Yoritomo's rebellion. His father Yoshitoki had helped establish the Hojo Regency. Yasutoki himself had marched west during the Jokyu War and participated directly in the victory that expanded Bakufu authority. He consequently inherited both the strength of the Hojo position and its dangers. The Hojo had become the dominant family in Kamakura, but their rule could not rest entirely upon force. They were not themselves shoguns. They governed through the office of shikin, or regent, while the formal shogunate remained above them. If their decisions came to appear merely as the private interests of one powerful family, the coalition of warriors supporting Kamakura could fracture in the same way earlier factions had. Yasutoki's solution was to make government more collective and its judgments more predictable. In 1225, the Bakufu created a council generally known as the Hyojoshu. Senior warriors and officials participated in deliberations over important matters, especially judicial cases. Yasutoki remained enormously influential, but the council gave the government a mechanism through which decisions could be discussed among experienced members of the regime, rather than issued entirely through the will of one regent. The change was not democratic in any modern sense. Political participation remained concentrated among a small military elite, and the Hojo continued to occupy a privileged position. Yet the council helped transform Kamakura from a government centered upon a charismatic founder into one capable of operating through procedure. This was important because the problems arriving before it were becoming increasingly technical. A warrior might claim that an estate had been granted to his father and therefore belonged to him. A brother could dispute the inheritance. A widow might possess rights granted by her husband. A Gito could be accused of withholding revenues owed to an aristocratic proprietor. Two families might each produce documents supporting a claim to the same land. A warrior could insist that years of peaceful possession proved his rights, even when another claimant possessed old paperwork. These were not peripheral issues in Kamakura society. Land was the material foundation of warrior life. A Gokunin's ability to maintain horses, weapons, retainers, and a household depended heavily upon the income produced by land and office. His obligations to Kamakura were connected to those resources. When the Bakufu demanded military service, the warrior was expected to equip himself from the wealth associated with his holdings. Property disputes therefore touched the military system directly. They exposed the complexity inherited from the Heian period. The establishment of Gito had never wiped older ownership arrangements clean. An aristocratic family in Kyoto might possess rights over an estate where a warrior appointed by Kamakura exercised local authority. A temple could retain claims to revenues while cultivators worked the land and local managers handled its daily operation. Rights could be divided, inherited, transferred, pledged, or disputed. The Bakufu needed rules that made sense to the people operating within this world. In 1232, Hojo Yashitoki oversaw the creation of one of the most important legal texts of medieval Japan, the Gosabai Shikimoku, sometimes called the Jowei Formulary, after the era in which it was issued. It consisted of 51 articles. Its purpose was practical. The formulary was primarily intended to guide the Bakufu in resolving disputes among warriors and administering the responsibilities that had accumulated under Kamakura rule. It did not attempt to replace every existing body of Japanese law. Court law continued to exist. Estate customs continued to matter, and religious institutions possessed rules of their own. The Gosabai Shikimoku addressed the world Kamakura actually governed. Its opening articles reveal the priorities of that world. The text begins with obligations toward shrines and Buddhist temples before moving into the duties of shugo. Other provisions deal with Gito, crimes, land possession, inheritance, the rights of women, false accusations, documentary evidence, and the conduct expected of those serving the Bakufu. Warrior government did not imagine itself as separate from religion or from the established moral structure of society. Shrines and temples required protection. Proper administration was connected with ideas of order, precedent, obligation, and accepted custom. Yasutoki explained that the formulary was intended in part for men who did not possess detailed knowledge of the sophisticated legal traditions used at the imperial court. Kamakura's warriors needed standards suited to the cases they actually encountered. The goal was to make judgments understandable within their own political community. The result was a body of law that often relied upon precedent and customary expectations rather than abstract legal theory. One of its most consequential principles concerned long possession of land. Under certain circumstances, a person who had held property peacefully for 20 years could have that possession recognized even when an older claim was later produced. The rule placed considerable weight upon established reality. A government trying to preserve stability could not allow every ancient document to reopen property arrangements that had been accepted for decades. Other articles attempted to restrain abuses by the officials Kamakura itself appointed. Agito was useful precisely because he possessed local authority, but that authority could be exploited. Estate proprietors complained about stewards who seized revenues, interfered with lands beyond their rights, or used their military position to overwhelm less powerful opponents. The formulary provided procedures for addressing such misconduct. The government was therefore regulating its own warriors as well as empowering them. The distinction was essential to the Bakufu's survival. Yoritomo had persuaded provincial fighters to accept Kamakura as a source of protection. If the strongest Gokunin could simply take what they wanted from weaker neighbors, the judicial system would lose its value. Kamakura's authority depended upon convincing its followers that a petition and judgment could sometimes accomplish what private violence otherwise would. The law also reveals a society in which women could possess significant property rights. Women in warrior families could inherit land and serve as estate holders, and widows might control property independently. The formulary recognized female inheritance rather than treating all property as automatically passing only through sons. A woman could receive an estate from a parent or husband and exercise meaningful authority over it. These rights were never absolute, and practices changed considerably over the medieval centuries. Families sought ways to prevent estates from being divided into holdings too small to sustain military obligations, a pressure that would gradually favor more concentrated male inheritance in later periods. During much of the Kamakura era, however, women remained visible participants in the property system that sustained warrior society. The political career of Hojo Masako had already demonstrated how influential an elite woman could become under exceptional circumstances. The quieter evidence of inheritance cases shows that women's relationship with property extended far beyond the exceptional life of the nun shogun. The shogun, by this point, remained a curious figure within the system. Kujo Yoritsune had been brought from Kyoto as a child after Sanetomo's death. In 1226, he formally received the shogunal title. His aristocratic ancestry gave the office prestige, but political authority remained largely with the Hojo regents and the council surrounding them. This arrangement was deliberate. The Hojo could govern without assuming a title for which their own lineage offered weaker justification. The shogun provided a recognized head of the military government. The regent administered around him. Councils provided additional participation by leading retainers. No single office tells us who ruled Japan during these years, because Japan was still governed through overlapping centers of authority. Kyoto remained home to the emperor and court. Kamakura managed the warrior network. Rokuhara watched over the relationship between them and extended Bakufu supervision into the west. Local estates contained their own combinations of proprietors, managers, warriors, cultivators, temples, and officials. The system worked through negotiation among these layers, as often as through commands descending from a single ruler. This can make Kamakura government appear less powerful than it was. In reality, its willingness to operate through existing institutions was one reason that it endured. The Bakufu did not need to administer every village directly. It needed to make itself indispensable in the matters most important to the warriors whose military power supported it. Land was one, justice was another, military obligation was a third. By concentrating upon these areas, Kamakura could exercise profound influence without constructing a centralized bureaucracy capable of supervising every aspect of life. Hojo Yasutoki's government also continued strengthening the relationship between Kamakura and Kyoto. He had spent part of his career at Rokuhara after the Gyokyu War and understood the importance of monitoring the court without destroying it. The imperial institution remained useful to the Bakufu, while aristocratic and religious proprietors remained embedded in the economic system from which many warriors drew their income. The relationship was unequal after 1221, but it remained a relationship. Yasutoki died in 1242. By then, Kamakura had moved far beyond the political experiment Yoritomo began during the Genpei War. The shogunate had survived its founder, the extinction of his line, a challenge from the imperial court, and the deaths of the Hojo leaders who had known him personally. It now possessed precedent. A warrior born in the middle of the 13th century did not need to remember why his grandfather had followed Yoritomo in 1180. He could grow up in a world where Kamakura had always existed. If his family held a Gito appointment, served as gokanin, presented disputes before Bakufu officials, or answered a military summons, those relationships were part of the political environment into which he had been born. The transformation was subtle enough that no single year captures it. Institutions developed because particular problems required solutions. The Genpei War required military organization. Victory required rewards. Land appointments produced disputes. Disputes required judgment. Expansion after the Gyokyu War created more cases, and more cases required procedures, which gradually became law. One need had produced the next. By the middle of the 13th century, the descendants of provincial fighters who once served aristocrats had developed courts, councils, administrators, legal principles, and a political capital of their own. But government documents reveal only a part of the society taking shape around them. Beyond the council chambers of Kamakura were fields worked by farming families, estates managed through overlapping layers of authority, roads carrying merchants and pilgrims, temples receiving visitors, coastal settlements connected to trade, and warrior households trying to preserve the land upon which their status depended. The Bakufu had answered instability by building those institutions. And by the middle decades of the 13th century, these transformations had become firmly established features of Japanese life. Kamakura's warriors governed from the east. The imperial court remained in Kyoto. Trade carried people and goods across the sea separating Japan from the Asian mainland. For most of the shogunate's existence, that sea had helped connect Japan with a wider world without threatening the survival of the government itself. But then, messages began arriving from beyond that sea. And those messages came from a ruler whose name was Kublai Khan. In January 1268, a ship from Korea reached the Japanese island of Tsushima, carrying a message intended for the rulers of Japan. The letter had originated far beyond Korea, at the court of a ruler whose authority extended across a larger territory than any Japanese government had ever confronted. Kublai Khan identified himself as the emperor of the great Mongol state. His message spoke of relations between neighboring countries and requested that Japan establish friendly diplomatic ties with his empire. There was also a warning. Kublai expressed the hope that weapons would not have to be used. For the Kamakura government, the arrival of this letter introduced a danger unlike any it had faced before. The The shogunate had been created through civil war. Its institutions had developed through disputes among Japanese warriors, conflicts with the imperial court, and the daily problems of governing land. Even the Jokyu War had remained a struggle between political institutions that shared the same islands and much of the same cultural world. The power now approaching Japan had been forged across continents. The Mongol expansion had begun more than half a century earlier under Temujin, better known by the title he received as Chinggis or Genghis Khan. In 1206, he united the Mongol tribes beneath his leadership and began a series of conquests that transformed the political geography of Eurasia. Mongol armies moved through northern China and Central Asia, destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, pushed into Persia and the Caucasus, and eventually campaigned deep into Eastern Europe. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his descendants continued the expansion. The empire became too large and politically complicated to remain permanently united beneath a single administration, but the various branches of the ruling family still commanded extraordinary resources. Mongol military success rested partly upon highly mobile cavalry, disciplined organization, intelligence gathering, logistical planning, and an ability to incorporate soldiers and specialists from conquered societies into later campaigns. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol world had reached East Asia's shores. Korea had already learned what resistance could cost. The Mongol invasions of the Korean kingdom of Goryeo began in 1231 and continued through repeated campaigns. The Goryeo court withdrew to the Ganghwa Island, where its position offered some protection from Mongol cavalry, while much of the mainland suffered through decades of warfare. Resistance continued in different forms, but eventually, the Goryeo monarchy reached an accommodation with the Mongols. By the time Kublai turned his attention toward Japan, Korea had become deeply entangled within the Mongol imperial system. This was important because Korea provided the nearest practical routes across the sea. Kublai himself was a grandson of Genghis Khan. After a succession struggle within the Mongol ruling family, he emerged as Great Khan in 1260. His principal ambitions centered upon East Asia, particularly the conquest of the southern Song dynasty, which still controlled much of southern China. In 1271, Kublai formally proclaimed the Yuan dynasty. His court governed from China while retaining the larger inheritance of Mongol imperial rule. The distinction between Mongol and Chinese forces in the invasions that followed can therefore become misleading if treated too rigidly. The armies and fleets assembled against Japan would draw upon Mongols, Chinese, Koreans, and others living under Yuan authority. Japan lay beyond the sea at the edge of this expanding political world. Kublai's first diplomatic approach appears to have been intended to secure Japan's submission without the cost of invasion. His letter used the language of diplomacy, but the hierarchy behind it was difficult to mistake. Other states had entered tributary or subordinate relationships with Mongol rulers. Kublai expected Japan to respond with an international order centered upon his own imperial authority. The Japanese court and the Kamakura Bakufu had little reason to accept that premise. The court in Kyoto discussed the letter. Kamakura took control of the practical response, which was that no official reply was sent. But silence did not end the matter, and further envoys followed. Kublai continued attempting to establish relations, and the repeated messages made the possibility of military action difficult to dismiss. Japanese leaders knew enough about the events on the Asian mainland to understand that the threat was serious. Korea's experience offered a nearby example of what Mongol warfare could mean. The Bakufu began preparing Kyushu. Responsibility fell upon Hojo Tokimune, who became the 8th Hojo regent in 1268, the same year the first Mongol letter reached Japan. Tokimune was still a young man, but he inherited a government far more developed than the one Yoritomo had left behind. The Bakufu possessed established networks of gokunin, provincial officials, legal institutions, and a presence extending into western Japan. The Jokyu War, fought nearly half a century earlier, had strengthened Kamakura's authority precisely in the regions now closest to the foreign threat. The consequences of that earlier civil war suddenly acquired a new purpose. Warriors in Kyushu could be mobilized through institutions already connected to Kamakura. Coastal defenses could be organized, and information could move through the Bakufu's western administration. The government also ordered religious institutions to pray for the protection of the country. To modern eyes, military mobilization and prayer can appear to belong to separate worlds. Kamakura's rulers would not have understood the distinction so sharply. Buddhist temples and shrines were parts of the political landscape, and ritual protection of the realm had deep precedent. When faced with an unprecedented foreign danger, the Bakufu prepared both materially and religiously. Years passed. Kublai's envoys continued arriving. Japan continued refusing to submit. And then, diplomacy finally gave way to invasion. In 1274, preparations began in Korea for a fleet capable of carrying an army across the Korean Strait. Goryeo was required to contribute ships, sailors, soldiers, supplies, and labor. The burden was substantial. Korea had already endured decades of Mongol warfare, and now had to help build the force that would attack another island kingdom. The invasion fleet departed from the Korean peninsula in the autumn. Its first targets were the islands between Korea and Kyushu. Tsushima lay directly across that route. The island had long served as one of Japan's gateways to the continent. Its position made it valuable for trade and communication during peaceful times. In an invasion, the same geography made it dangerously exposed. Mongol-led forces landed there in early November 1274. The local defenders were badly outnumbered. So Sukakuni, the deputy military governor of Tsushima, gathered what warriors he could and confronted the invading army. The resistance failed. Sukakuni was killed, and the invaders overran the island. From Tsushima, the fleet continued toward Iki. The pattern repeated. Local warriors resisted, but could not stop an army designed for a much larger campaign. The islands that had connected Japan with Korea now became stepping stones toward Kyushu. News of their destruction moved ahead of the fleet, and the main invasion force approached Hakata Bay. Japanese warriors assembled to meet it. On November 19th, according to the traditional Japanese calendar corresponding to late November 1274, the invaders began landing around Hakata Bay. The fighting that followed exposed Japanese warriors to methods of warfare shaped by a very different military environment. Later Japanese accounts emphasized contrasts between individual samurai combat and the coordinated tactics of the invading forces. These descriptions have sometimes been exaggerated into a picture of Japanese warriors attempting to fight formal single combats while Mongol soldiers simply ignored the rules. But medieval Japanese warfare was never so orderly, and the samurai were fully capable of fighting in groups. Still, there were genuine differences. The Yuan forces operated through organized infantry formations and employed massed missile fire. Their armies included troops accustomed to fighting within larger coordinated units. They also used explosive projectiles unfamiliar enough to Japanese observers that they became one of the memorable features of the invasion. Some of our most striking evidence comes from an illustrated scroll created after the wars. Takezaki Suenaga was a Gokunin from Higo province in Kyushu who fought against the invaders. Afterward, he commissioned the work usually known as the Moko Shurai Ekitoba, the illustrated account of the Mongol invasions. The scroll is valuable because Suenaga's purpose was that he wanted recognition. Military service within the Kamakura system depended upon proving what a warrior had done. A man who fought bravely but could not demonstrate his actions to the appropriate officials might struggle to receive an award. Suenaga therefore pursued witnesses and traveled to Kamakura, seeking acknowledgement of his service. The images associated with his account show mounted Japanese warriors confronting enemy troops, arrows crossing the battlefield, and explosive projectiles bursting near the fighting. They also remind us that the battle was experienced at human scale. The Mongol invasions are often described through fleets numbering hundreds of ships and armies containing thousands of men. Suenaga experienced them from horseback, surrounded by companions, trying to find enemies, surviving incoming missiles, and performing deeds that someone else could confirm afterward. His experience also complicates the familiar claim that Japanese warriors were helpless against the invaders' tactics. They were not. The fighting around Hakata was severe. Japanese forces suffered casualties and were pushed back from parts of the coast, but they continued resisting. The invaders did not simply sweep through Kyushu. As evening approached, the Yuan forces returned toward their ships. What happened during that night became one of the most debated episodes in the history of the invasion. A storm struck the fleet. Later Japanese traditions placed enormous emphasis upon destructive winds that helped save the country, eventually contributing to the famous idea of the kamikaze, or divine wind. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources do not support the presence of severe weather associated with the withdrawal, but historians have debated how much destruction the first storm actually caused, and whether the invasion had already been abandoned for military reasons. The fleet had reasons to leave, even without supernatural intervention. The invaders had suffered losses. Their commanders were operating far from their supply bases. The campaign season was late. Japanese resistance had been stronger than a simple landing operation might have anticipated. Some accounts suggest that disagreements among commanders or the wounding of a senior leader contributed to the decision to withdraw. The storm then made that withdrawal more dangerous. Ships were lost and men were drowned. The surviving fleet returned toward Korea, and Japan had repelled the invasion. But Hojo Tokamune did not assume the danger had passed. Kublai Khan had not treated the expedition as his final opportunity to bring Japan into submission. From the Yuan perspective, the failure of one campaign did not alter the underlying political demand. More envoys came. In 1275, a Yuan delegation arrived in Japan seeking submission. This time, Kamakura's response was even more unmistakable. The envoys were taken to Kamakura, and executed. Another delegation arriving several years later met a similar fate. Whatever political ambiguity had existed in 1268 was gone. The Bakufu expected another invasion. Preparations began almost immediately after the first attack. Warriors in Kyushu were ordered to maintain vigilance. The government reorganized defensive responsibilities and required men with interests in the region to contribute to the defense. Most visibly, the Japanese began building a stone defensive wall around portions of Hakata Bay. The fortifications extended for many miles along the coast. They were not monumental walls comparable to the great defensive systems found elsewhere in Eurasia, but they were well suited to the immediate problem facing Kyushu. The first invasion had shown how dangerous it was to allow enemy troops to land freely along the bay. The wall would make the next landing much harder. Japanese strategy was changing because of experience. Warriors also became more aggressive at sea. Small Japanese vessels could approach enemy ships, allowing fighters to board or attack crews directly. The samurai were adapting to an enemy whose methods had been unfamiliar in 1274. The government prepared for years. The expected invasion did not come immediately because Kublai remained occupied with a far larger war. The southern Song dynasty was still resisting Yuan conquest of China, but that resistance finally collapsed in 1279. And with the Song defeated, Kublai controlled resources unavailable to him during the first invasion of Japan. Ships, sailors, soldiers, and ports from southern China could now be incorporated into another expedition. And the scale of the next undertaking would dwarf the first. Two major forces were prepared. One would sail again from Korea. The other would come from southern China. Medieval sources give enormous figures for the armies involved, sometimes describing forces numbering well over 100,000 men. But the precise totals remain uncertain, and modern historians have good reason to treat the large numbers cautiously. But what is beyond dispute is that the second expedition was much larger than the first, and required a massive effort to assemble ships, supplies, crews, and troops from different parts of Kublai's empire. In Japan, the years of waiting had produced their own burden. Kyushu warriors had to maintain defenses against an attack whose date no one knew. Coastal fortifications required labor. Guard duty took men away from other responsibilities. The Bakufu had to coordinate military service without the benefit of conquering new Japanese territory from which rewards might eventually be drawn. That problem had not yet become fully visible. For the moment, fear of invasion gave the warriors an obvious reason to serve. Religious institutions intensified their prayers. The Hojo government maintained its preparations. Across the sea, the Yuan fleets gathered. In the summer of 1281, 7 years after the first invasion, ships once again appeared off Japan. This time, the defenders were waiting behind walls they had built specifically for the men approaching them. The Mongols had learned from 1274, but so had Kamakura. And the struggle that followed would become one of the most famous episodes in Japanese history, remembered for a storm powerful enough to acquire a divine name. But before the wind arrived, there would be weeks of fighting. And what happened during those weeks would determine whether there was still a Japan left for the storm to save. When the second invasion fleet approached Japan in 1281, it found a coastline very different from the one its predecessors had encountered 7 years earlier. The first Yuan expedition had been able to enter Hakata Bay and place troops ashore before Japanese defenders fully understood how the invasion would unfold. The fighting of 1274 had given the Kamakura government something almost as valuable as victory itself: experience. Hojo Tokamune and the Bakufu had spent the intervening years preparing for another attack. Warriors in Kyushu remained under orders to defend the coast. Military responsibilities had been reorganized. Watch was maintained over the approaches from Korea. Most visibly, a long stone defensive wall had been constructed along vulnerable portions of Hakata Bay. But Kublai Khan had also learned from their first campaign. The expedition prepared against Japan in 1281 was larger and more complicated than the force sent in 1274. Since the first invasion, the Yuan dynasty had completed its conquest of the southern Song, giving Kublai access to the ships, ports, sailors, and soldiers of southern China. The new invasion would therefore approach Japan through two major forces. The Eastern Route Army assembled in Korea. It included Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops, and was intended to cross by the familiar route through Tsushima and Iki before approaching Kyushu. A much larger force, generally called the Southern Route Army, was assembled from territories of the former Southern Song. It would sail from China and join the Eastern force for the main attack. On paper, the plan placed enormous resources at Kublai's disposal. But in practice, coordinating two fleets across hundreds of miles of sea was difficult. The Eastern Route Army departed first. Tsushima once again stood directly in its path. Yuan forces landed there in June 1281, followed by attacks on Iki. The island suffered another invasion before the fleet moved toward northern Kyushu. This time, the Japanese knew where it was going. When Yuan ships entered the waters around Hakata Bay, the defenders were waiting. The wall along the coast changed the character of the battle almost immediately. Landing troops from medieval ships was already a dangerous operation. Men had to move from vessels toward the shore, while carrying weapons and equipment, often using smaller boats, and attempting to maintain formation in shallow water. Horses and supplies created additional complications. Now, the invaders had to do so under attack while confronting prepared positions. Japanese warriors resisted from behind and around the fortifications, preventing the Yuan army from establishing the kind of foothold it needed. The fighting continued rather than being decided from a single engagement. This is one of the most important differences between the popular memory of the second invasion and the campaign itself. Later retellings often compress the story into a simple sequence. An enormous Mongol fleet appeared, Japan faced destruction, and a miraculous typhoon annihilated the invaders. Again. The storm was real and devastating, but Japan had been fighting for weeks before it arrived. The surviving account associated with Takezaki Suenaga again gives us a view from the level of an individual warrior. Suenaga had fought in 1274 and had spent considerable effort afterward proving his service to Kamakura. When the invaders returned, he fought once more. The illustrated scrolls associated with him depict Japanese warriors attacking enemy positions and approaching ships. They show a conflict taking place across beaches, defensive works, small boats, and crowded vessels, rather than a passive defense awaiting rescue from the weather. The Japanese tactics had changed. During the first invasion, the Yuan forces had surprised defenders with coordinated formations and weapons unfamiliar to many Japanese warriors. By 1281, the samurai understood more about the enemy they faced. They made use of the defensive walls, and also carried the battle onto the water. At night, small Japanese vessels moved toward the Yuan fleet. Warriors boarded enemy ships when opportunities arose, fighting crews at close quarters and attempting to damage vessels or kill soldiers before withdrawing. These attacks could not destroy the entire invasion fleet, but they made remaining close to shore dangerous. The Yuan commanders consequently faced an uncomfortable problem. Their army needed access to land, but the coastline was strongly defended. Their ships provided mobility and temporary protection, yet keeping thousands of men aboard crowded vessels for long periods created difficulties of its own. Food and fresh water had to be distributed. Disease could spread. Horses were difficult to maintain at sea, and summer weather added another uncertainty. The Eastern Route Army could not simply remain in Hakata Bay indefinitely, and so it withdrew toward nearby islands and waited for the larger Southern Route force. But that force was late, and the delay exposed one of the central weaknesses of Kublai's ambitious plan. The soldiers were sailing from former Song territory had been assembled after years of warfare on the Chinese mainland. Their fleet required enormous quantities of ships and supplies, and the expedition involved populations only recently incorporated into Yuan rule. Eventually, the Southern Route Army reached Japanese waters. The two forces now represented a threat much larger than anything Japan had faced in 1274, but their long delay had given the defenders valuable time. The Japanese had not been defeated at Hakata. The wall still stood, and the warriors remained mobilized. The invasion therefore shifted toward the waters around Takashima and the approaches to northern Kyushu. Fighting continued through the summer. Estimating the number of men involved is difficult. Medieval sources provide enormous figures for the Yuan armies, and some traditional totals reach well above 100,000 troops. Modern historians generally treat such precise numbers cautiously. Fleet sizes and troop strength in medieval chronicles can be exaggerated, and losses during the later storm make exact reconstruction even harder. Whatever the true number, the expedition was immense by the standards of medieval maritime warfare. Supplying that fleet was a formidable task. Every soldier had to eat, fresh water had to be carried or obtained, ships needed crews, damaged vessels required repair, animals required space and provisions of their own. Commanders had to coordinate units speaking different languages and coming from different military traditions. Time increasingly favored the Japanese defenders. And then, just as it had 7 years earlier, the weather changed. In August 1281, a powerful storm struck the waters around the invasion fleet. For ships crowded together near the coast, the consequences were catastrophic. Strong winds and waves drove vessels against one another and toward the shore. Ships broke apart, others capsized. Men who survived the destruction of their vessels found themselves in violent seas or stranded on islands and coastlines where Japanese warriors could reach them. The quality of the ships may have influenced the scale of the disaster. Later arguments sometimes claim that Kublai's fleets were composed largely of poorly constructed river vessels, incapable of surviving open water. But the evidence is more complicated. Archaeological work on Yuan period shipwrecks has revealed substantial maritime construction, while the hurried scale of the invasion likely produced vessels of varying quality. No wooden fleet of the 13th century needed to be badly built to suffer terribly in a major typhoon. The storm destroyed a significant portion of the invasion force. Those who survived faced Japanese attacks as organized resistance collapsed. Some were killed, others were captured. Portions of the fleet escaped and returned to the continent. The second invasion had failed. Kublai Khan would consider further expeditions, and Japanese authorities could not immediately know that no third invasion would ever arrive. Preparations therefore continued for years. Yet 1281 marked the end of the actual Mongol attempts to conquer Japan. For the Bakufu, the result was an extraordinary military success. Japan had faced the most powerful imperial system in East Asia and survived 2 invasions. The explanation for that survival became part of Japanese religious memory almost immediately. Temples and shrines had spent years performing rituals for the protection of the country. When the invading fleets were destroyed by storms, religious communities naturally interpreted the event within the sacred framework through which they understood the crisis. The winds had not simply happened. They had happened to protect Japan. Different institutions claimed that their prayers or their deities had contributed to the victory. Hachiman, whose connection to the warrior government reached back to Yoritomo, could be invoked as a protector of the realm. Buddhist temples likewise presented their rituals as part of the country's defense. Over time, the idea of the kamikaze, the divine wind, became the most famous element of the invasions. The phrase would acquire meanings in much later Japanese history that the people of the 13th century could not have anticipated. Within the Kamakura world, however, divine intervention offered a coherent explanation for an event that must have appeared extraordinary. An immense fleet had approached Japan, and a storm shattered it. Religious institutions that had prayed for protection could point toward the wreckage as evidence that those prayers had been answered. The interpretation did not require Japanese warriors to believe that their own efforts had been meaningless. Medieval warfare did not demand a choice between human action and divine assistance. The defenders could fight behind walls, launch raids against enemy ships, and still believe that supernatural powers had completed the victory. Modern historical analysis can separate these factors more carefully. Weather was decisive, particularly in 1281. Without the storm, the campaign could have continued, and no historian can know with certainty what the final outcome would have been. But the storm did not strike a Japan that had already been defeated. The fortifications around Hakata had worked. Japanese warriors had prevented the Yuan forces from securing an easy landing. Repeated attacks had kept pressure on the fleet. The invaders were struggling with coordination and logistics after weeks of campaigning. The wind entered a battle already in progress. And understanding that distinction is important because the Mongol invasions would influence the way later generations understood both the samurai and Japan's relationship with the outside world. A simple miracle story obscures the years of preparation and work that made resistance possible. Kamakura had survived because the political system built during the previous century could mobilize warriors across western Japan. The Jokyu War had expanded Bakufu authority into precisely the regions now threatened by invasion. The offices created under Yoritomo and strengthened under the Hojo provided mechanisms for military service. The government could issue orders to Gokunin, coordinate defenses, construct fortifications, and keep men stationed in Kyushu over long periods. The same institutions developed to manage disputes over Japanese land had proven capable of defending the country from a foreign empire. Victory should have strengthened the shogunate exponentially, and in some ways it did. Hojo Tokamune emerged with considerable prestige. The Bakufu had demonstrated its military purpose more clearly than at any point since the Genpei War. The imperial court had not directed the defense, Kamakura had. Yet the victory contained a problem hidden beneath the celebrations. Warriors expected rewards for military service. That expectation had been part of the political system since Yoritomo's rebellion. After the Genpei War, the lands of the defeated Taira supporters could be confiscated and redistributed. Warriors who served Yoritomo could receive appointments and property connected to the defeated enemy. After the Jokyu War, the same process occurred on an even wider scale. Estates belonging to supporters of Gotoba were confiscated, and loyal Gokunin gained positions that expanded Kamakura's influence into Western Japan. Civil war created losers whose property could reward the winners. The Mongol invasions created no such defeated Japanese faction. The enemy came from across the sea. And when the surviving Yuan soldiers sailed away, their land remained in Korea and China. Kamakura had not conquered them. There were no great estates on the Japanese islands that could be seized from Kublai Khan and distributed among the defenders of Kyushu. The warriors had fulfilled their obligations. Many had spent money equipping themselves and their followers. Some had traveled long distances. Others had remained on guard for years. Families had lost men. Horses and equipment had been consumed by service. Yet the government possessed comparatively little new land with which to compensate them. Takezaki Suenaga's determination to prove his actions during the first invasion becomes especially revealing in this context. He did not commission a record merely because he wanted future generations to admire his courage. Recognition of service had material consequences. A warrior needed his deeds acknowledged. His military obligation and reward were supposed to reinforce one another. The Bakufu could grant offices, confirm claims, provide limited rewards, and distribute what resources were available. There was simply not enough conquered property to reproduce the generosity that had followed earlier wars. The difficulty continued after 1281 because Kamakura could not know that the invasions were over. Kublai remained alive. The Yuan dynasty remained powerful. Reports of further preparations reached Japan. Coastal defenses therefore had to remain active. Warriors continued guard duty in Kyushu. Fortifications required maintenance. Military readiness consumed resources, even though no enemy appeared. For families already struggling with divided inheritances and limited estates, prolonged service could become a serious burden. The government had saved their lands from foreign conquest. Now some warriors found themselves indebted while trying to preserve those same lands. Religious institutions also sought rewards. Temples and shrines that believed their prayers had helped defeat the invaders petitioned for recognition and grants. From their perspective, spiritual service had been part of national defense. The Bakufu and court, therefore, faced claims from both the men who had fought and the institutions that believed they had secured divine protection. Victory produced more claimants than resources. But this pressure did not immediately destroy the Kamakura government. It is tempting to draw a straight line from the Mongol invasions to the collapse of the Shogunate half a century later. But history moved more slowly. The Bakufu remained functional after 1281. The Hojo retained substantial authority. Most warriors did not suddenly rebel because rewards were disappointing. The invasions instead intensified weaknesses that were already developing. Warrior families had been dividing property across generations. Some Gokunin were borrowing money. Economic life was becoming monetized. The cost of military obligations could be substantial. The Hojo were accumulating greater power within a government that had once depended more heavily upon cooperation among several important warrior families. None of these pressures alone were fatal, but together they changed the relationship between Kamakura and the men whose loyalty sustained it. Hojo Tokimune did not live long enough to see where those changes would lead. He died in 1284, only 3 years after the second invasion, at the age of 33. His short life had been dominated by the Mongol threat. He had become regent in the year Kublai's first letter arrived, and had governed through both invasions. When he died, Japan remained independent. The Yuan fleets were gone, and the defenses he helped organize had succeeded. The government he left behind appeared victorious. But beneath that victory, the balance created by Yoritomo was beginning to shift. For a century, the Bakufu had maintained loyalty through an exchange that warriors understood. Service brought protection, loyalty brought recognition, victory could bring reward. The Mongol invasions had required more service than any previous conflict. They had also produced fewer rewards. The storm had removed Kublai Khan's armies from Japan, but it could not remove the debts, divided estates, political rivalries, and disappointed expectations they left behind. Those pressures would remain on land, where the next crisis of the Kamakura Shogunate was already beginning to take shape. The underlying problems that were beginning to surface within Kamakura could not be solved by simply issuing better judgments. A finite amount of productive land was supporting a growing number of descendants. Economic changes added another pressure. The expansion of markets and the increasing circulation of Chinese copper currency had made monetary exchange more common. Warriors participated in that economy, whether they wanted to or not. Military equipment cost money. Travel cost money. Maintaining households and fulfilling ceremonial obligations cost money. Guard service could take a warrior away from his own lands while continuing to consume resources. When expenses exceeded available income, borrowing offered a solution. Moneylenders and merchants became important figures within the developing economy. Religious institutions could also participate in lending and financial activity. A warrior short of cash might pledge land rights as security, or transfer control of property in exchange for money. Debt itself did not mean ruin. Credit allowed people to respond to immediate needs and could support economic activity. The danger came when a warrior could not repay what he owed. Land pledged temporarily might pass permanently into other hands. Gokunin, whose status depended upon his estate, could therefore find himself losing the very resources that allowed him to perform the military service expected by Kamakura. From the Bakufu's perspective, this was more than a private financial problem. It was an army composed of landholding warriors. If those warriors lost their land to creditors, the military foundation of the government weakened with them. The Mongol invasions intensified the difficulty because they had demanded extraordinary service without creating a comparable source of new property. Warriors in Kyushu had equipped themselves, fought, maintained defenses, and continued guard duties after 1281. The government could reward some service and confirm claims, but there was no defeated domestic enemy whose estates could be redistributed on the scale seen after the Genpei or Jokyu Wars. The Bakufu faced a problem that earlier victories had taught its followers not to expect. They had won, and there was little to divide. Nor could Kamakura immediately release them from military obligations. Kublai Khan survived until 1294, and for years Japanese leaders feared another expedition. The Yuan court considered further attacks, even though none ultimately took place. From Kamakura, the absence of a fleet in any particular year could not be treated as proof that the danger had ended. Kyushu therefore remained on guard. The cost of victory continued long after the fighting stopped. By the late 13th century, the Bakufu was attempting to protect indebted warriors through increasingly direct intervention. The most famous measure came in 1297. That year, the government issued the Ainin Tokusai, commonly described as a debt cancellation or virtuous government decree. Its provisions attempted to restore certain lands that Gokunin had sold or pledged and to limit the ability of creditors to pursue some debts against them. The intention was understandable. If loyal warriors had lost the property required to sustain their service, the government could try to return that property. But changing the legal consequences of yesterday's loan changed the willingness of someone to make tomorrow's. Creditors who feared that agreements could later be canceled had reason to become more cautious about lending to warriors. A policy intended to relieve financial pressure could therefore make future access to credit more difficult. The decree also revealed something deeper. Kamakura was trying to preserve a social relationship created in the late 12th century inside an economy that had continued evolving around it. Yoritomo had built his political order around land-holding warriors who served a lord capable of confirming and rewarding their property rights. More than a century later, those rights existed within expanding markets, monetary debts, fragmented inheritance, and increasingly complicated transfers of land. Bakufu could issue orders, but it could not make those economic changes disappear. And financial pressure was only one source of dissatisfaction. The internal structure of Hojo rule had changed as well. During the early generations of the shogunate, political authority had been distributed among several important warrior houses. The Hojo had gradually defeated or marginalized many of their rivals, but the government still operated through councils and senior retainers. Hojo Yashitoki's reforms had helped create a political culture in which collective deliberation and precedent mattered. Over time, greater authority accumulated around the senior line of the Hojo family. This line was known as the Tokuso. The term originally referred to the head of the main Hojo house. As the 13th century progressed, the Tokuso and the officials personally connected to him became a political center in their own right. But the change did not abolish the regency or the councils. Instead, another layer of authority developed around them. The Hojo leader could retire formally from an office and still exercise considerable influence as head of the main family. Private retainers associated closely with Tokuso acquired important positions. Decisions could be shaped by a narrower circle before reaching the institutions through which Kamakura was formally governed. The arrangement became especially important during the career of Hojo Tokamune. Tokamune had been the dominant figure during the Mongol crisis, and the extraordinary danger of those years naturally encouraged concentrated leadership. Military preparation required rapid decisions and dependable chains of authority. After his death in 1284, however, the political structure built around the senior Hojo line remained. Tokamune's son, Hojo Sadatoki, succeeded him while still a boy. A child at the center of an already powerful family created opportunities for the adults around him. Among the most influential was Taira no Yoritsuna, a close retainer of the Takuso house. Yoritsuna had risen within the political system surrounding Tokamune and became increasingly powerful after the regent's death. Another major figure was Adachi Yasumori. The Adachi were an old warrior family with close connections to the Hojo and to the founding history of the Bakufu. Yasamori had held important positions and became involved in the efforts to reorganize government after the Mongol invasions. The rivalry between the political circles surrounding Yasamori and Yoritsuna ended violently. In 1285, the conflict erupted in what became known as the Shimotsuki Incident. Yoritsuna moved against Yasamori and his supporters. Fighting broke out in Kamakura, and Yasamori was killed. Members and allies of the Adachi family were destroyed or removed from political influence. Factional violence was hardly new to the shogunate. The early Hojo had risen through a series of struggles in which many powerful houses had been eliminated. What made the Shimotsuki incident important was the political environment in which it occurred. The Bakufu were no longer a young regime struggling to survive its founder. It was an established government more than a century old. Yet violence among the elite still offered a means of deciding who would control it. The victory strengthened Yoritsuna and the private political network surrounding the Tokuso. For several years, his influence was immense. Then the pattern repeated. In 1293, Hojo Sadatoki turned against him. Yoritsuna and many of his supporters were killed. The episode strengthened Sadatoki's personal position while further demonstrating how much Kamakura politics had become concentrated around the household of the senior Hojo. The shogun remained above this system in title. By now, however, the office had traveled a remarkable distance from Yoritomo. After the Fujiwara shoguns of the earlier 13th century, Kamakura had begun receiving imperial princes as shoguns. These men possessed exceptional lineage and considerable ceremonial prestige, but practical government remained in Hojo hands. A shogun who became politically inconvenient could be removed and returned to Kyoto. The institution that Yoritomo had personally dominated had become detached from the person occupying its highest office. That arrangement worked as long as the warrior families beneath it accepted Hojo leadership. For many, there remained good reasons to do so. The Bakufu still provided courts, still confirmed land rights. It still possessed mechanisms for settling disputes that warriors depended upon. The memory of the Mongol invasions had demonstrated the value of coordinated military government, and no obvious alternative promised to solve the economic problems confronting indebted Gokunin. Dissatisfaction should therefore not be mistaken for universal opposition. Most warriors did not spend the decades after 1281 waiting for an opportunity to destroy Kamakura. Many continued serving it. The danger lay elsewhere. A political system based heavily upon relationships of service did not need every warrior to become hostile before it was vulnerable. It needed enough important families to decide, during a future crisis, that their interests no longer required the preservation of the Hojo government. That crisis had not yet arrived. The imperial court, meanwhile, remained in Kyoto. The defeat of Go-Toba in 1221 had permanently altered its relationship with Kamakura. Retired emperors had been exiled, court lands confiscated, and the Rokuhara Tandai established to supervise the West. No later emperor could easily forget what happened when the court challenged the Bakufu without sufficient military support. Yet the imperial institution itself had survived untouched. The Hojo never attempted to abolish it. Emperors continued reigning. Retired emperors continued possessing influence. Court families maintained estates and cultural prestige. The imperial lineage remained the source from which shogunal titles ultimately derived their legitimacy. This survival preserved possibilities that were easy to overlook while Kamakura remained strong. The court also developed problems of its own. During the later 13th century, a dispute emerged within the imperial family over succession. The origins lay partly in the reign of Emperor Go-Saga, who who had ruled in the middle of the century. Two lines descended from his sons developed competing claims to the throne. One became known as the Jimyoin line, the other as the Daikakuji line. Both possessed legitimate imperial ancestry, but neither were simply willing to surrender its claims. Kamakura became involved in managing the dispute. An arrangement gradually developed in which the throne alternated between the two branches. From the Bakufu's perspective, alternation offered a practical means of preventing either side from monopolizing the succession and destabilizing relations with the court. From within the imperial family, the solution could feel very different. The shogunate created by warriors was now helping determine which descendants of the imperial house would occupy the throne. For an emperor determined to restore greater authority to his own institutions, that intervention could become intolerable. One such emperor emerged from the Daikakuji line. His personal name was Takaharu, and in 1318, he ascended the throne as Emperor Go-Daigo. He was already an adult, unlike many emperors whose childhood ascensions allowed retired sovereigns and senior courtiers to dominate affairs around them. Go-Daigo intended to govern, and his ambitions would eventually reach much further. By the time he became emperor, the Kamakura Shogunate had existed for well over a century. The government had survived every major challenge placed before it. Its laws had become established. Its officials governed throughout the country. The Hojo had defeated rivals within Kamakura and enemies from across the sea. The Bakufu could therefore appear permanent. Yet permanence was precisely what Yoritomo's government had once denied the Taira. Political order survived only while the relationships supporting them continued to function. The Hojo still possessed armies, institutions, and authority. What they could not know was how many warriors would fight for them if the imperial court challenged Kamakura again. Go-Toba had attempted to answer that question in 1221 and discovered that the Gokanin remained loyal to the Bakufu. More than a century later, Go-Daigo would ask that question again, and this time, the answer would be different. When Emperor Go-Daigo ascended the throne in 1318, the Kamakura Shogunate was nearly a century and a half old. For most people alive in Japan, warrior government was no longer an innovation. No living person remembered the world before Minamoto no Yoritomo established himself at Kamakura. The Hojo Regency had survived foreign invasions, imperial rebellion, assassinations, factional struggles, economic difficulties, and repeated changes of shogun. Its officials were established throughout the country. Its courts adjudicated disputes among the warriors, and its representatives at Rokuhara maintained a watchful presence in Kyoto. Yet the imperial throne had survived alongside it. The emperors had never become irrelevant. The court retained its rituals, titles, estates, cultural prestige, and a political legitimacy that the Bakufu itself continued to recognize. Shoguns still received their title from the emperor. Even the Hojo, despite exercising enormous practical power, governed through institutions that formerly existed beneath an imperial order they had never attempted to abolish. For generations, this balance had been maintained through negotiation. Go-Daigo intended to change it. Unlike many emperors who had ascended as children and spent their reigns beneath the influence of retired sovereigns, Go-Daigo was 30 years old when he took the throne, and he intended to exercise authority personally. He wanted the succession to continue through his own descendants, rather than surrendering the throne according to an arrangement shaped by Kamakura. But behind the succession dispute lay a larger ambition. Go-Daigo wanted to restore direct imperial government. Exactly how completely he intended to dismantle the warrior political order from the beginning is difficult to know. His plans developed over time, and later events inevitably shaped the way his earlier actions were remembered. What became clear was that he regarded Hojo dominance as an obstacle to imperial authority. The emperor was preparing to challenge a government that had defeated his predecessor Go-Toba a century earlier. The memory of 1221 could hardly have been encouraging. Go-Toba had issued an imperial command against Hojo Yoshitoki and expected warriors to abandon the Bakufu. But instead, the Gokunin rallied to Kamakura. Hojo armies marched west, defeated the imperial forces, entered Kyoto, and sent Go-Toba into exile. Go-Daigo therefore needed something Go-Toba had lacked. He needed warriors willing to fight for the throne. During the 1320s, the emperor cultivated supporters among court figures, religious institutions, and military men. Meetings and discussions surrounding opposition to Kamakura became sufficiently serious that the Bakufu eventually discovered them. The first conspiracy collapsed before it could become war. In 1324, authorities uncovered what became known as the Shochu Incident. Several of Go-Daigo's associates were arrested or punished. The emperor denied involvement and for the moment escaped deposition. The episode should have served as a warning. Instead, Go-Daigo continued. His determination reflected more than personal stubbornness. Conditions within the warrior government had changed since the Jokyu War. Hojo authority remained formidable, but dissatisfaction among some warriors had grown. But that did not mean Japan was waiting to rally around the emperor. Many warriors still served Kamakura faithfully. Others cared more about local rivalries and property than about theories of imperial restoration. A call from Kyoto would matter only if political circumstances gave them a reason to answer it. Go-Daigo continued searching for those circumstances. By 1331, another conspiracy had formed. This time, the Bakufu moved decisively. Go-Daigo fled Kyoto and took refuge at Kasagi, a fortified mountain position southeast of the capital. Imperial supporters gathered around him, while other loyalists prepared resistance elsewhere. The emperor had crossed the line between conspiracy and open rebellion. And Kamakura responded with military force. Among Go-Daigo's supporters was a warrior whose later reputation would become inseparable from the ideal of loyalty to the imperial cause. Kusunoki Masashigi came from the Kawashi province. His origins and early career are not as clearly documented as later legends would suggest, but by 1331, he had emerged as one of the emperor's most effective military supporters. His strength did not lie in commanding the largest army. It lay in making small forces difficult to destroy. Masashigi became associated with fortified mountain positions and methods that allowed defenders to exploit terrain against numerically superior enemies. At Akasaka, and later at Chihaya, forces connected to him resisted armies sent by the Bakufu in campaigns that acquired an importance far greater than the size of the fortresses themselves. Go-Daigo's own position at Kasagi did not hold. Bakufu troops captured the mountain stronghold. The emperor attempted to escape, but was taken prisoner. Kamakura had defeated him. A century earlier, that might have ended the rebellion. The Bakufu removed Go-Daigo from the throne and recognized Emperor Kogon of the rival Jimyoin line. Go-Daigo was then sent into exile to the Oki Islands. The choice of destination carried an unmistakable historical echo. Go-Toba had been exiled to the same islands after the Jokyu War. The Hojo appeared to have repeated their earlier victory. An emperor had challenged Kamakura. The challenge had failed. A replacement had been installed, and the defeated sovereign had been removed from the political center. But Japan in 1332 was not Japan in 1221. Resistance continued after Go-Daigo's capture. Kusunoki Masashigi remained active. Prince Moriyoshi, one of Go-Daigo's sons, helped sustain opposition. other warriors began joining a rebellion that no longer depended upon the emperor's physical presence in Kyoto. The Bakufu could defeat individual strongholds, but it was having more difficulty extinguishing the movement behind them. Chihaya Castle became especially troublesome. Masashiki and a relatively small force defended the mountain fortress against a much larger Bakufu army. Kamakura was forced to commit substantial manpower against a position that refused to fall. Every month the siege continued made the Bakufu look less invincible. Then, Go-Daigo escaped. In 1333, he fled the Oki Islands and returned to the mainland, where supporters began gathering around him again. The rebellion entered a new phase. Kamakura ordered more warriors to suppress it. Among those summoned was Ashikaga Takauji. The Ashikaga were no obscure provincial family. They belonged to a distinguished warrior lineage, the same broad Minamoto line from which Yoritomo had emerged. Their ancestry gave them prestige among warriors, and their family possessed substantial lands and military connections. They had served the Kamakura government for generations. Takauji had every reason to be treated as one of its important commanders, and he was sent west to fight for it. Instead, he turned against it. Why Takauji defected has been debated ever since. Later accounts naturally interpreted his actions through the conflicts that followed, and his motives cannot be reduced to a single grievance. Relations between the Ashikaga and the Hojo may have contributed. The weakness exposed by the spreading rebellion certainly mattered. So did the opportunity presented by Go-Daigo's return. Whatever combination of calculation, resentment, and ambition guided him, Takauji made a decision that transformed the world. He declared for emperor. Then he attacked the Bakufu's representatives in Kyoto. The Rokuharu Tondai had stood in the capital since the aftermath of the Gyokyu War. For more than a century, it had embodied Kamakura's ability to supervise the imperial court and maintain military authority in western Japan. In 1333, Ashikaga Takauji destroyed it, and the fall of Rokuhara was devastating. Kamakura had lost its principal western headquarters, and it had been destroyed by one of the warrior commanders the Bakufu itself had sent to defend its authority. The old relationship between service and loyalty was coming apart, and another rebellion was already developing in the east. Niita Yoshisada, another warrior with Minamoto ancestry, had also turned against the Hojo, and his forces advanced toward Kamakura. The city Yoritomo had chosen more than 150 years earlier possessed formidable natural defenses. Hills surrounded it on three sides, while the sea protected the fourth. Narrow passes controlled the principal land approaches. The same geography that had made Kamakura an attractive military capital now made a direct assault difficult. Hojo defenders prepared to hold those approaches, and Yoshisada attacked. Fighting took place around the passes leading into the city. Some assaults were repelled. The defenders knew the terrain and understood that if the narrow entrances could be held, a larger attacking army could be prevented from using its numbers effectively. Later tradition gave the decisive breakthrough a sacred character. According to the famous story, Yoshisada reached the coast and found his advance blocked by the sea. He prayed to the sun goddess Amaterasu and cast his sword into the water as an offering. The tide then receded, allowing his troops to move around the coastal defenses. This episode became one of the best-known legends surrounding Kamakura's fall. The precise military reality was likely more ordinary. Tidal conditions along the coast could expose a rout at the appropriate time, and Yoshisada's forces were able to exploit the shoreline while pressure continued elsewhere. However the breakthrough occurred, the result was catastrophic for the Hojo. Enemy troops entered Kamakura, and fighting spread through the city. The political center from which the Hojo had governed Japan for generations was now a battlefield. The last Tokosu, Hojo Takatogi, had already withdrawn from formal office, but he remained the central figure of the senior Hojo line. As the defenses collapsed, Takatoki and many members of his family gathered at the temple of Tosoji. There was no realistic route of escape, and thus, in May 1333, Takatoki and large numbers of Hojo relatives and retainers took their own lives. Later accounts place the number of dead in the hundreds, and the Hojo Regency ended with them. Its destruction was strikingly sudden. For decades, the Bakufu had appeared capable of surviving almost anything. Yet institutions ultimately depended upon people willing to defend them. The government had not been defeated by an imperial army marching directly from Kyoto. It had been destroyed largely by warriors. The distinction explains both Go-Daigo's success and the problems that he was about to encounter. The emperor had helped create the political cause around which opposition could gather. His persistence gave dissatisfied warriors an alternative source of legitimacy. His escape from exile revived a rebellion that Kamakura had believed contained. But the men who had won the war possessed ambitions of their own. Ashikaga had not destroyed Rokuhara merely to return the position of an obedient provincial servant beneath a restored court aristocracy. Yoshisada had not marched into Kamakura because warrior political power had suddenly ceased to matter. The military class created by the Kamakura period was not going to disappear simply because the Kamakura Shogunate had fallen. For the moment, however, Go-Daigo had achieved something extraordinary. He returned to Kyoto in triumph. The rival Emperor Kogon was removed. The arrangements through which the Hojo had supervised the imperial succession were swept aside. Go-Daigo began what later historians call the Kinmu Restoration, an attempt to rebuild government around direct imperial authority. The name suggests a return to older political order, but in reality, there was no simple older world to which Japan could return. A century and a half of warrior government had changed the country. Generations of samurai had grown accustomed to receiving rewards, offices, judgments, and recognition through military institutions. Warrior families controlled extensive lands. Their political expectations had been shaped by Kamakura. Their service had defeated the Taira, suppressed Go-Toba, resisted Kublai Khan, and now overthrown the Hojo themselves. Go-Daigo needed those warriors to regain his throne. Now he had to govern them. Almost immediately, disputes emerged over appointments and rewards. Men who had fought against the Bakufu expected compensation. Court nobles and religious institutions sought the restoration of lands they had claimed been taken during Hojo rule. Competing petitions arrived before a government attempting to sort through generations of accumulated property rights. Go-Daigo favored a revival of imperial authority and court institutions. Many warriors wanted something closer to the political world they already understood. At the center of that contradiction stood Ashikaga. For the moment, emperor and warrior remained allies, but it would not last. The Kamakura Shogunate had fallen in 1333. Its political inheritance was now being fought over by the people who replaced it. Go-Daigo had demonstrated that the Hojo could be destroyed. He had failed to demonstrate that warrior government could be undone. And though the Hojo were dead, Kamakura was fallen, and the Minamoto shogunal line had vanished more than a century earlier, the idea of a warrior government headed by a shogun still endured. And with that survival, the Kamakura period left behind a legacy far greater than the city from which it took its name.